Part 11. Back to Bowen. 1. Casuals of the road. From Ningxia I turned southward again into Gansu. In 4 or 5 days I was back in Helianwan, where I again saw Cai Chang and her husband, Li Fuzhun, and had another meal of French cooking with them, and I met the young and pretty wife of Nie Zhongzhen, political commissar of the First Army Corps. She had but recently slipped into the Soviet districts from the White World, and had now just returned from a visit to her husband, whom she had not seen for 5 years. I stayed 3 days in Helianwan with the Supply Commissariat, which was quartered in a big compound formerly owned by a Mohammedan grain merchant. Architecturally it was an interesting group of buildings of a generally Central Asian appearance, with flat, heavy roofs and deep Arabic windows set into walls at least 4 feet thick. As I led my horse into its spacious stables, a tall, white-bearded man wearing a faded grey uniform with a long leather apron that reached to the ground stepped up and saluted his red-starred cap, while his sunburned face wreathed a toothless smile. He took charge of Ma Hongquei, my horse. How, I wondered, had this grandfather wandered into our Boy Scout encampment? I stopped to ask, and forced a story from him. He was from Shanxi, and had joined the Red Army during its expedition there. His name was Li, and he was 64, and he had claimed the distinction of being the eldest Red Warrior. Rather apologetically, he explained that he was not at the front just then, because Commander Yang thinks I am more useful here at this horse work, and so I stay. Li had been a pork seller in the sound of Hongtong, Xianxi, before he became a Red, and he roundly cursed model governor Yan Xishan and the local officials and their ruinous taxes. "You can't do business in Hongtong," he said. "They tax a man's excrement." When old Li heard the Reds were coming, he had decided to join them. His wife was dead, and his 2 daughters were both married. He had no sons, he had no ties at all in Hongtong, except his overtaxed pork business, and Hongtong was a dead man sort of place anyway. He wanted something livelier, and so the adventurer had crept out of the city to offer himself to the Reds. When I wanted to enlist, they said to me, "You are old, in the Red Army life is hard." And what did I say? I said, "Yes, this body is 64 years old, it's true, but I can walk like a boy of 20, I can shoot a gun, I can do the work of any man. If it's men you need, I can also serve." So they told me to come along, and I marched through Shanxi with the Red Army, and I crossed the Yellow River with the Red Army, and here I am in Gansu. I smiled and asked him whether it was any better than pork selling. Did he like it? "Ho, ho! Pork selling is a turtle man's sort of business. Here is work worth doing. A poor man's army fighting for the oppressed, isn't it? Certainly I like it." The old man fumbled in his breast pocket and brought forth a soiled cloth, which he carefully unwrapped to reveal a worn little notebook. "See here," he said, "I already recognize over 200 characters. Every day the Red Army teaches me 4 more. In Shanxi I lived for 64 years, and yet nobody ever taught me how to write my name. Is the Red Army good, or isn't it?" He pointed with intense pride to the crude scrawl of his characters that resembled the blots of muddy hen's feet on clean matting, and falteringly he read off some newly inscribed phrases, and then, as a sort of climax, he produced a stub of pencil, and with an elaborate flourish, he wrote his own name for me. "I suppose you're thinking of marrying again," I joked with him. He shook his head gravely and said no. What with one defile mother horse after another, he had no time to think about the woman problem, and with that he ambled away to look after his beasts. Next evening, as I was walking through an orchard behind the courtyard, I met another Shanxi man, 20 years Li's junior, but just as interesting. I heard Xiao Kui calling out, "Li Bai Tang, Li Bai Tang," and looked in curiosity to see whom he was addressing as the House of Christian Worship. There, upon a little hill, I found a barber shaving a youth's head clean as an egg. Upon inquiry, I discovered that his real name was Jia Hezhong, and that he had formerly worked in the pharmacy of an American missionary hospital in Pingyang, Shanxi. The little devils had given him this nickname because he was a Christian, and still said his prayers daily. Jia pulled up his trousers and showed me a bad wound on his leg, from which he still limped, and he had yanked up his coat to display a wound on his belly, where he had also been hit. These, he explained, were souvenirs of battles, and that was why he was not at the front. This haircutting wasn't his real job at all. He was either a pharmacist or a Red Warrior. Jia said that 2 other attendants in that Christian hospital had joined the Reds with him. Before leaving, they had discussed their intention with the American doctor at the hospital, whose Chinese name was Li Ren. Dr. Li Ren was a good man who healed the poor without charge and never oppressed people, and when Jia and his companions asked his advice, he had said, "Go ahead. I have heard that the Reds are good and honest men, and not like the other armies, and you should be glad to fight with them." So off they had gone to become Reds, Red Robin Hoods. "Maybe Dr. Li Ren just wanted to get rid of you," I suggested. The barber indignantly denied it. He said he had always got along very well with Li Ren, who was an excellent man. He asked me to tell this Li Ren, if I ever saw him, that he was still alive, well, and happy, and that as soon as the revolution was over, he was coming back to take his old job in the pharmacy. I left House of Worship with much reluctance. He was a fine Red, a good barber, and a real Christian. Incidentally, I met several Christians and ex-Christians among the Reds. Many communists had once been active Christians. Dr. Nelson Fu, head of the Red Army Medical Corps, was formerly a doctor in a Methodist hospital in Jiangxi. Although he volunteered to work with the Reds and enthusiastically supported them, he still adhered to his faith and hence had not joined the Communist Party. In Jiangxi, the Soviets carried on extensive anti-God propaganda. All temples, churches, and church estates were converted into state property, and monks, nuns, priests, preachers, and foreign missionaries were deprived of the rights of citizenship. But in the northwest, a policy of religious toleration was practiced. Freedom of worship was a primary guarantee, in fact. All foreign mission property was protected, and refugee missionaries were invited to return to their flocks. The communists reserved the right to preach anti-religious propaganda of their own, holding the freedom to oppose worship to be a corollary of the democratic privilege of the freedom to worship. The only foreigners who took advantage of the new communist policy towards religious institutions were some Belgian missionaries who were among the great landlords of Suiyuan. They owned one vast estate of 20,000 mo, and another of some 5,000 mo of land near Dingpian on the Great Wall. And after the Red Army occupied Dingpian, one side of the Belgians' property lay adjacent to Soviet territory, and the other side was held by white troops. The Reds did not attempt to expropriate the Belgians' land, but made a treaty in which they guaranteed to protect the church property, provided the priests permitted them to organize anti-Japanese societies among the tenants who tilled the land of this big Catholic missionary fiefdom. Another stipulation of the curious agreement provided that the Belgians would dispatch a message from the Chinese Soviet government to the Premier Blum of France, congratulating him on the triumph of the People's Front. There had been a series of raids by Mintuan near Helianwan, and one village only a short distance away had been sacked 2 nights before I arrived. A band had crept up to the place just before dawn, overpowered and killed the lone sentry, and had then brought up bunches of dry bushwood and set fire to the huts in which about a dozen Red soldiers were sleeping. As the Reds ran out, blinded by the smoke, the Mintuan had shot them down and seized their guns. Then they had joined with a gang of some 400, most of them armed by the Kuomintang general, Gao Guizi, who were raiding down from the north and burning farms and villages. The 28th Army had sent a battalion out to attempt to round them up, and the day I left Helianwan, these young warriors came back after a successful chase. The battle had occurred only a few li from Helianwan, which the white bandits were said to have been preparing to attack. Some peasants had discovered the Mintuan lair in the inner mountains, and, acting on this information, the Reds had divided into 3 columns, the centre one meeting the bandits in a frontal clash. The issue was decided when the 2 flanking columns of Reds closed in and surrounded the enemy. Some 40 Mintuan were killed, and 16 Reds, while many on both sides were wounded. The Mintuan was entirely disarmed, and their 2 chieftains were taken captive. We passed the battalion returning with their captives as we rode back towards Shanxi. A big welcome had been organised in the villages, and the peasants lined the roads to cheer the victorious troops. Peasant guards stood holding their long red-tasselled spears in salute, and the young vanguards sang Red songs to them, while girls and women bought refreshments, tea and fruit and hot water, all they had, but it creased the faces of the weary soldiers with smiles. They were very young, much younger than the frontline regulars, and it seemed to me that many who wore blood-stained bandages were no more than 14 or 15. I saw one youth on a horse, half-conscious and held up by a comrade on each side, who had a white bandage around his forehead, in the exact centre of which was a round red stain. There, in the midst of this column of youngsters, who carried rifles almost as big as themselves, marched the 2 bandit chieftains. One of them was a grizzled, middle-aged peasant, and one wondered whether he had felt ashamed being led by these warriors, all young enough to be his sons. Yet there was something rather splendid about his fearless bearing, and I thought that he was, after all, possibly a poor peasant like the rest, perhaps one who had also believed in something when he fought them, and it was regrettable that he was to be killed. Fu Jingui shook his head when I asked him. We don't kill captured Mintuan. We educate them and give them a chance to repent, and many of them later become good Red partisans. It was fortunate that the Reds had erased this group of bandits, for it cleared our road back to Bowen. We made the trip from the Gansu border in 5 days, doing more than 100 li on the 5th, but though there was plenty of incident, there was no event, and I returned with no trophies except cantaloupes and melons I had bought along the road. 2. Life in Bowen. Back in Bowen again, I settled down once more in the Waijiabu, the Foreign Office, where I stayed throughout late September and half of October. I collected enough biographies to fill a who's who in Red China, and every morning turned up a new commander or Soviet official to be interviewed. But I was becoming increasingly uneasy about departure. Nanjing troops were pouring into Gansu and Shanxi, and were gradually replacing the Dongbei troops everywhere they held a front with the Reds, as Chiang Kai-shek made all preparations for a new annihilation drive from the south and the west. Someone else could write that story. I wished to publish the one I already had, but I wouldn't be able to do that unless I got out alive, and it took time for my hosts to guarantee a secure passage back over the lines. Unless I got out soon, it might prove impossible. The last fissure in the blockade might be closed. Meanwhile, life in Bowen went on tranquilly enough, and you would not have supposed that these people were aware of their imminent annihilation. Not far from me, a training regiment of new recruits was quartered. They spent their time marching and counter-marching all day, playing games and singing songs. Some nights there were dramatics, and every night the whole town rang with song, as different groups gathered in barracks or in cave grottos, yodeling down the valley. In the Red Army University, the cadets were hard at work on a 10-hour day of study. A new mass education drive was beginning in the town. Even the little devils in the Waijiabu were being subjected to daily lessons in reading, politics, and geography. As for myself, I lived a holiday life, riding, bathing, and playing tennis. There were 2 courts, one set up on the grassy meadow clipped close by the goats and sheep, near the Red University, the other a clay court next door to the cottage of Bo Gu, the gangling former party general secretary, now chairman of the Northwest Branch Soviet government. Here, every morning, as soon as the sun rose above the hills, I played tennis with 3 faculty members of the Red University, the German, Li De, Commissar Cai Shufan, and Commissar Wu Xiuchuan. The court was full of stones. It was fatal to run after a fast ball. But the games were nevertheless hotly contested. Cai and Wu both spoke Russian to Li De, while I talked to Li De in English and to Cai and Wu in Chinese, so that we thus had a trilingual game. A more corrupting influence I had on the community was my gambling club. I had a pack of cards, unused since my arrival, and one day I got these out and taught Commissar Cai to play rummy. Cai had lost an arm in battle, but it handicapped him very little at either tennis or cards. After he had learned rummy, he easily beat me with one hand. For a while, rummy was the rage. Even the women began sneaking up to the Waijiabu gambling club. My mud Kang became the rendezvous of Baoan's elite, and you could look around the candlelit faces there at night and recognize Mrs. Zhou Enlai, Mrs. Bo Gu, Mrs. Kai Feng, Mrs. Deng Fa, and even Mrs. Mao. It set tongues wagging. But the real menace to Soviet morals didn't appear till Bowen took up poker. Our tennis quartet started this, alternating nights at Li De's hut and my own base of iniquity in the Foreign Office. Into this sinful mire we dragged such respectable citizens as Bo Gu, Li Kenong, Kai Feng, Lo Fu, and others. Stakes rose higher and higher. One-armed Cai Shufan finally cleaned up $120,000 from Chairman Bu Gu in a single evening, and it looked as if Bu Gu's only way out was embezzlement of state funds. We settled the matter by ruling that Bu Gu would be allowed to draw $120,000 on the treasury to pay Cai, provided Cai would use the money to buy aeroplanes for the non-existent Soviet Air Force. It was all in matches, anyway, and unfortunately so were the aeroplanes that Cai bought. One-armed Cai was quick-witted, excitable, full of repartee and badinage. He had been a Red for a decade, having joined while he was a railway worker in Hunan. Later on he'd gone to Moscow and studied there for 2 or 3 years, and found time to fall in love with and marry a Russian. Sometimes he looked ruefully at his empty sleeve and wondered whether his wife wouldn't divorce him when she saw his missing arm. "Don't worry about a little thing like that," Professor Wu, who was also a returned Russian student, would comfort him. "If you haven't had your posterity shot off when you see her again, you'll be lucky." Nevertheless, Cai kept urging me to send him an artificial arm when I got back to the white world. This was only one of the impossible requests I had for things to be sent in. Lu Dingyi wanted me to buy, equip, and man an air fleet for them from the proceeds of the sale of my pictures of the Reds. Xu Haidong wanted a couple of false teeth to fill in the gap in his gums. He had fallen in love. Everybody had somebody wrong with his teeth. They hadn't seen a dentist for years. Most of the older leaders suffered from some kind of ailment, especially from ulcers and other stomach trouble, as a result of years on a dubious diet. But I never heard anybody complaining. Personally, I thrived on the food and put on weight, and my disgust at facing the unvaried menu every day did not prevent me from swallowing embarrassing quantities of it. They made me the concession of steamed bread made from whole wheat flour, which when toasted was not bad, and occasionally I had pork or mutton shashlik. Besides that, I lived on millet, boiled millet, fried millet, baked millet, and vice versa. Cabbage was plentiful, and peppers, onions, and beans. I missed coffee, butter, sugar, milk, eggs, and a lot of things, but I went right on eating millet. A batch of copies of the North China Daily News arrived for the library one day, and I read a recipe for what seemed to be a very simple sponge cake. I knew Borgu was hoarding a tin of cocoa in his hut, and I schemed that with some of this, and by substituting pig's fat for butter, I could make that cake. Accordingly, I got Li Kenong to write out a formal application to the chairman of the Northwest Branch of Soviet Government of the Chinese Soviet Republic to supply me with 2 ounces of chocolate. After several days of delay, and hemming and hawing, and doubts and aspersions cast upon my ability to bake a cake anyway, and a lot of unravelling of red tape, and conflicts with the bureaucracy in general, we finally forced these 2 ounces of cocoa out of Borgu, and got other materials from the food cooperative. Before I could mix up the batter, my bodyguard came in to investigate, and the wretch knocked the cocoa on the ground. Followed more red tape, but finally I got the order refilled and began the greatest experiment. Why labour the result? Any intelligent Hausfrau can foresee what happened. My improvised oven failed to function properly, the cake did not rise, and when I took it off the fire it was a 2-inch layer of charcoal on the bottom, and a top still in a state of slimy fluidity. However, it was eaten by the interested onlookers in the Waijiabu with great relish. There were too many good materials in it to be wasted. I lost immense face, and thereafterward docilely consumed my millet. Li De compensated by asking me to a foreign meal with him. He had a way of getting rice and eggs sometimes, and being German, he made his own sausages. You could see them swinging in strings drying outside his door near the main street of Bowen. He was getting ready his winter's supply. He had also built himself a fireplace and taught his Chinese wife, a girl who had come with him from Jiangxi, how to bake. He showed me that the materials were there for tolerable cooking. It was only that the food cooperative, where our meals were cooked in common, didn't know how it should be done. Mrs. Luo Pinghui, wife of a Red Army commander, and the only lily-footed woman who made the long march, was chief chef of the cooperative, and I think Li De's wife had a pull with her, and that is how he garnered his eggs and sugar. But Li De was more than a good cook and a good poker player. Who was this mystery man of the Chinese Soviet district? Had his importance been exaggerated by the Kuomintang general, Lord Zhou Ying, who, after reading some of Li De's writings found in Jiangxi, described him as the brain trust of the Reds? What was his connection with Soviet Russia? How much influence, in fact, did Russia exercise over the affairs of Red China? 3. The Russian influence. This volume does not have as one of its primary purposes an examination of relations between the Communist Party of China and the Communist Party of Russia, or the Comintern, or the Soviet Union as a whole. No adequate background has been provided here for such a task, but the book would be incomplete without some discussion of these organic connections and their more significant effects on the revolutionary history of China. Certainly and obviously, Russia had for the past dozen or more years been a dominating influence, and particularly among educated youth it had been the dominant external influence on Chinese thought about the social, political, economic and cultural problems of the country. This had been almost as true, though unacknowledged, in the Kuomintang areas as it had been an openly glorified fact in the Soviet districts. Everywhere in China that youth had any fervent revolutionary beliefs, the impact of Marxist ideology was apparent, both as a philosophy and as a kind of substitute for religion. Among such young Chinese, Lenin was almost worshipped, Stalin was the most popular foreign leader, socialism was taken for granted as the future form of Chinese society, and Russian literature had the largest following. Maxim Gorky's works, for example, outselling all native writers except Lu Xun, who was himself a great social revolutionary, although not a communist. And all that was quite remarkable for one reason especially. America, England, France, Germany, Japan, Italy, and other capitalist or imperialist powers had sent thousands of political, cultural, economic, or missionary workers into China, actively to propagandize the Chinese masses with credos of their own states. Yet for many years the Russians had not had a single school, church, or even a debating society in China where Marxist-Leninist doctrines could legally be preached. Their influence, except in the Soviet districts, had been largely indirect. Moreover, it had been aggressively opposed everywhere by the Kuomintang. Yet few who had been in China during that decade and conscious of the society in which they lived would dispute the contention that Marxism, the Cultural Revolution, and the new society of the Soviet Union had probably made more profound impressions on the Chinese people than all Christian missionary influences combined. One had to remember that the Chinese Communists' adherence to the Comintern and unity with the USSR were voluntary and could have been liquidated at any time by the Chinese from within. The role of the Soviet Union had for them been most potent as a living example that bred hope and faith. The Chinese Reds stoutly believed that the Chinese Revolution was not isolated, and that hundreds of millions of workers, not only in Russia but throughout the world, were anxiously watching them, and when the time came would emulate them, even as they themselves had emulated the comrades in Russia. In the day of Marx and Engels, it might have been correct to say that the workers have no country, but the Chinese communists believed that, besides their own little bases of power, they had a mighty fatherland in the Soviet Union. The Soviet government in China read the constitution adopted by the First All-China Soviet Congress, declares its readiness to form a revolutionary united front with the world proletariat and all oppressed nations, and, italicized, proclaims the Soviet Union, the land of proletarian dictatorship, to be its loyal ally. How much the words italicized meant to the Chinese Soviets, which in truth most of the time were completely isolated geographically, economically, and politically, was hard to understand for any Westerner who had never known a Chinese communist. The idea of having behind them a great ally, even though it was less and less validated by demonstrations of positive support from the Soviet Union, was of primary importance to the morale of the Chinese Reds. It imparted to their struggle the universality of a religious cause, and they deeply cherished it. When they shouted, "Long live the world revolution," and "Proletarians of all lands unite," it was an idea that permeated all their teaching and faith, and in it they reaffirmed their allegiance to the dream of a socialist world brotherhood. It seemed to me that these concepts had already been shown that they could change Chinese behavior. I never suffered from any anti-foreignism in the Reds' attitude toward me. They were certainly anti-imperialist, but racial prejudice seemed to have been sublimated in class antagonism that knew no national boundaries. Even their anti-Japanese agitation was not directed against the Japanese on a racial basis. In their propaganda, the Reds constantly emphasized that they opposed only the Japanese militarists, capitalists, and other fascist oppressors, and that the Japanese masses were their potential allies. Indeed, they derived great encouragement from that conviction. This changing of national prejudice from racism to class antagonism was no doubt traceable to the education in Russia of scores of the Chinese Red leaders who had attended Sun Yat-sen University, or the Red Academy, or some other school for international cadres of communism, and had returned as teachers to their own people. One example of their internationalism was the intense interest with which the Reds followed the events of the Spanish Civil War. Bulletins were issued in the press, were pasted up in the meeting rooms of village Soviets, were announced to the armies at the front. Special lectures were given by the political department on the cause and significance of the Spanish Civil War, and the People's Front in Spain was contrasted with the Unified Front in China. Mass meetings of the populace were summoned, demonstrations were held, and public discussions were encouraged. It was quite surprising sometimes to find, even far back in the mountains, Red farmers who knew a few rudimentary facts about such things as the Italian conquest of Abyssinia and the German-Italian invasion of Spain, and spoke of these powers as the fascist allies of their enemy, Japan. Despite their geographical isolation, these rustics knew much more about that aspect of world politics, thanks to radio news and war newspapers and communist lecturers and propagandists, than the rural population anywhere else in China. The strict discipline of communist method and organization had seemingly produced among Chinese Marxists a type of cooperation and suppression of individualism, which the average old China hand, or treaty port merchant, or missionary who knew Chinese psychology, would have found impossible to believe without witnessing for himself. In their political life, the existence of the individual was an atomic pulse in the social whole, the mass, and must bend to its will either consciously in the role of leadership or unconsciously in the part of material demiurge. There had been disputes and internecine struggles among the communists, but none severe enough to deal a fatal injury to either the army or the party. Had Nanjing been able at any time to split their military and political strength into contradictory and permanently warring factions, as it did with the other opposition groups, as Chiang Kai-shek did with his own rivals for power within the Kuomintang, the task of communist suppression might have been rewarded with final success. But its attempts were failures. For example, a few years before, Nanjing had hoped to utilize the worldwide Stalin-Trotsky controversy to divide the Chinese communists. But although so-called Chinese Trotskyites did appear, they never developed any important mass influence or following. The Reds had generally discarded much of the ceremony of traditional Chinese etiquette, and their psychology and character were quite different from old conceptions of Chinese people. They were direct, frank, simple, undevious, and scientific-minded. They were also implacable enemies of the old Chinese familism. With their zealous adoration of the Soviet Union, there had naturally been a lot of copying and imitating of foreign ideas, institutions, methods, and organizations. The Chinese Red Army was constructed on Russian military lines, and much of its tactical knowledge derived from Russian experience. Social organizations in general followed the pattern laid down by Russian Bolshevism. Many songs were put to Russian music and widely sung in the Soviet districts. Su Wei Ai, Chinese for Soviet, was only one example of many words transliterated directly from Russian into Chinese. But in their borrowing there was much adaptation. Few red ideas or institutions survived without drastic changes to suit the milieu in which they operated. The empirical process of a decade eliminated indiscriminate wholesale importations, and also resulted in the introduction of peculiarly Chinese features. A process of imitation and adoption of the West had, of course, been going on in the bourgeois world of China too, for there was very little left even of poetry of the ancient feudal heritage, that scrap material of great history, as Spengler calls it, which the Chinese were able to use in building either a modern bourgeois or a socialist society capable of grappling with the vast new demands of the country. While the Reds leaned heavily on Russia for organizational methods with youth, Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek not only used Italian bombing planes to destroy them, but also borrowed from the YMCA in building his anti-communist New Life movement. And finally, of course, the political ideology, tactical line, and theoretical leadership of the Chinese Communists had been under close guidance, if not positive direction, of the Communist International. Great benefits undoubtedly accrued to the Chinese Reds from sharing the collective experience of the Russian Revolution and from the leadership of the Comintern, but it was also true that the Comintern could be held responsible for serious reverses suffered by the Chinese Communists in the anguish of their growth. 4. Chinese Communism and the Comintern. It is possible to divide the history of Sino-Russian relations from 1923 to 1937 roughly into three periods. The first, from 1923 to 1927, was a period of triple alliance between the Soviet Union and the nationalist revolutionaries, consisting of strange bedfellows aligned under the banners of the Kuomintang and the Communist parties, and aiming at the overthrow by revolution of the then extant government of China, and the restoration of China's complete sovereignty. That enterprise ended with the triumph of the right-wing Kuomintang, the founding of the national government at Nanjing, the latter's compromise with the colonial power, and the severance of Sino-Russian relations. From 1927 to 1933, there was a period of isolation of Russia from nationalist China and its complete insulation against Russian influence. This era closed when Moscow resumed diplomatic relations with Nanjing late in 1933. The period then began with a lukewarm Nanjing-Moscow rapprochement, embarrassed considerably by the continued heavy civil war between Nanjing and the Chinese Communists. It was to end dramatically early in 1937, when a partial reconciliation was effected between the Communists and the Kuomintang, with new possibilities opened up for Sino-Russian cooperation. The three periods of Sino-Russian relationship mentioned above accurately reflected also the changes in the character of the Comintern and its stages of transition. It is important here to enter into the complex causes, domestic and international, which brought about those changes, both in the Soviet Union and in the Comintern, but it is pertinent to see how, in the main, they had affected and were affected by the Chinese Revolution. In 1927, crisis of the Chinese Revolution coincided with a crisis in Russia, and in the Comintern, expressed in the struggle between Trotskyism and Stalinism for theoretical and practical control of Russia. Had Stalin been able to advance his slogan, socialism in one country, much earlier than 1924, had the issue been fought out, and had he been able to dominate the Comintern before then, quite possibly the intervention in China might never have begun. Such a speculation, in any case, was idle now. When Stalin did develop his fight, the line in China had already been cast. The active military, political, financial, and intellectual collaboration given to the Chinese nationalist revolution was, until 1926, under the direction chiefly of Zinoviev, who was chairman of the Communist International. Then, from early 1926 onward, Stalin became chiefly responsible for the affairs and policies of the Comintern, as well as the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, and it was nowhere disputed that he had tightened his grasp on both organizations ever since. Thus, it was Stalin who led the Comintern that gave the Chinese Communists their tactical line and directives in 1926, and during the catastrophe of the spring of 1927. During those fateful months in which disaster gathered above the heads of the Chinese Communists, Stalin's line was subjected to continuous bombardment from the opposition, dominated by Trotsky, Zinoviev, and Kamenev. While he was Comintern chairman, Zinoviev had fully supported the line of communist cooperation with the Kuomintang, but he violently attacked the same line as carried out by Stalin, particularly after Chiang Kai-shek's first treachery, the abortive attempt at a coup d'etat in Guangzhou in 1926. Zinoviev predicted an inevitable counter-revolution in which the nationalist bourgeoisie would compromise with imperialism and betray the masses. At least a year before Chiang Kai-shek's second and successful coup d'etat, Zinoviev began demanding the separation of the communists from the Comintern, the party of the national bourgeoisie, which he now considered incapable of carrying out the two main tasks of the revolution: anti-imperialism, i.e. the overthrow of foreign domination of China, and anti-feudalism, or the destruction of the landlord gentry rule in rural China. Just as early, Trotsky began urging the formation of Soviets and an independent Chinese Red Army. The opposition in general foretold the failure of the bourgeois democratic revolution, all they had hoped for in this period, if Stalin's line was continued. Stalin defended himself after the debacle by ridiculing as non-Marxist the Trotskyist contentions that the tactical line of the Comintern had been the main cause of the failure. Comrade Kamenev, declared Stalin, said that the policy of the Communist International was responsible for the defeat of the Chinese Revolution, and that we bred Cavagnacs in China. How can it be asserted that the tactics of our party can abolish or reverse the relation of class forces? What are we to say of people who forget the relation of class forces in time of revolution, who try to explain everything by the tactics of a party? Only one thing can be said of such people, that they have abandoned Marxism. Trotsky required no help from me in framing appropriate replies to Stalin's self-exculpations, but as his wit had not prevented the early destruction of communist regimes in Hungary and Bavaria, nor the general defeat of the Comintern's hopes throughout the East, so it did not save the Chinese communists from a catastrophe which all but destroyed the party. Only Stalin won. That is, he drove Trotsky from the temple, and consequently Stalin dominated future activities of the Comintern in China, which for a while were practically nil. Russian organs in China were closed. Russian communists were killed or driven from the country. The flow of financial, military, and political help from Russia dwindled. The Chinese Communist Party was thrown into great confusion, and for a time its interior leadership lost contact with the Comintern. The rural Soviet movement and Mao's Chinese Red Army began spontaneously, and they did not, in fact, get much applause from Russia until after the Sixth Congress, when the Communist International gave its postnatal sanction. After 1927, it became impossible for Russia to have any direct physical connection with the Chinese Red areas, which had no seaport and were entirely surrounded by a ring of hostile troops. Whereas in the past there had been scores of Comintern workers in China, there were now 2 or 3, often almost isolated from society as a whole, seldom able to risk a stay of more than a few months. Whereas a large flow of Russian gold and arms had formerly gone to Chiang Kai-shek's nationalists, now a trickle reached the Reds. And whereas the whole Soviet Union had backed the Great Revolution of 1925 to 1927, the Russian communist movement was now aided only by a Comintern which could no longer command the vast resources of the base of the world revolution, but had to limp along as a kind of poor stepchild which might officially be disinherited whenever it did anything malaprop. Actual financial help given to the Chinese Reds by Moscow or the Comintern during this decade seemed to have been amazingly small. When Mr. and Mrs. Hilaire-Noulon were arrested in Shanghai in 1932 and convicted in Nanjing as chief Far Eastern agents of the Comintern, police evidence showed that total outpayments for the whole Orient, not just China, had not at most exceeded the equivalent of about $15,000 per month. This was a trifle compared with the vast sums poured into China to support Japanese and Nazi fascist propaganda. It was rather pitiful also in contrast, for example, with America's $50,000 wheat loan to Nanjing in 1933, the proceeds of which were of decisive value to Chiang Kai-shek's civil war against the Reds, according to reports of foreign military observers. America, England, Germany, and Italy sold Nanjing great quantities of aeroplanes, tanks, guns, and munitions, but of course sold none to the Reds. The American army released officers to train the Chinese Air Force, which demolished towns in Red China, and Italian and German instructors actually led some of the most destructive bombing expeditions themselves, as happened on a larger scale in Spain. To Chiang Kai-shek's aid, Germany sent von Secht, and after him von Falkenhausen, with a staff of Prussian officers who improved Nanjing's technique of annihilation. It seemed that Chiang Kai-shek was propped up for nearly 10 years by more important aid than any foreign power gave the Reds. Probably the Chinese Reds fought with less material foreign help than any army in modern Chinese history. 5. That foreign brain trust. There had not been a single foreign advisor with China's Red Army during the first 5 years of its existence. Not until 1933 did Li De appear in the Jiangxi Soviet districts as a German representative of the Comintern to take a high position both politically and militarily. Yet despite the numerical insignificance of this foreign influence, several responsible communists in the northwest apparently felt that Li De's advice had been to a great extent responsible for two costly mistakes in the Jiangxi Red Republic. The first, as Mao Zedong pointed out, was the failure of the Red Army to unite with the 19th Route Army, when the latter arose in revolt against Nanjing in the autumn of 1933. The 19th Route Army, commanded by Generals Qian Mingxiu, Cai Dingkai, and Zhang Guangnai, had made an impressive defense of Shanghai against the Japanese attack of 1932, and had demonstrated its strong national revolutionary character. Transferred to Fujian after the Shanghai Truce, it gradually became a centre of political opposition to Nanjing's non-resistance policy. Following Nanjing's negotiation in the humiliating Tangku Truce with Japan, the 19th Route Army leaders set up an independent government in Fujian province and started a movement for a democratic republic and the destruction of Chiang Kai-shek's regime. The 19th Route Army was one of the few Kuomintang military units never defeated by the Reds, and they had great respect for its fighting ability. Composed mostly of Cantonese, it really reflected in its political character a loosely organised left-wing opposition movement. It was the main military support of several factions on the periphery of the Kuomintang, led by the Shehui Minzhu Dang, the Chinese Social Democrats. Sent to Fujian to participate in communist suppression late in 1932, the 19th Route Army leaders instead quickly built up a base of their own from which to oppose Chiang Kai-shek. They entered into a non-aggression agreement with the Reds and proposed an anti-Nanjing, anti-Japanese alliance, along much the same lines that were later on evolved in the northwest between the Manchurian, the northwestern, and the communist armies. But instead of cooperating with the 19th Route Army, the Reds withdrew their main forces from the Fujian border to western Jiangxi. That left Chiang Kai-shek free to descend from Zhejiang into neighbouring Fujian with little impediment. The Generalissimo struck before the 19th Route Army was prepared militarily or politically, and quickly quashed the insurgents. The Reds consequently lost their strongest potential allies. There is no doubt that elimination of the 19th Route Army very much facilitated the task of destroying the Southern Soviets, to which Chiang Kai-shek at once turned with a new confidence early in 1934. The Reds' second serious mistake was made in the planning of strategy and tactics to meet Chiang's new offensive, the Fifth Campaign. In previous campaigns, the Reds had relied on superiority in maneuvering warfare, and their ability to take the initiative from Chiang Kai-shek in strong, swift concentrations and surprise attacks. Positional warfare and regular fighting had always played minor roles in their operations, but in the Fifth Campaign, according to Red commanders to whom I talked, Li De insisted upon a strategy of positional warfare, relegating partisan and guerrilla tactics to auxiliary tasks, and somehow won acceptance for his scheme against, so I was told, unanimous opposition of the Red Military Council. But whatever errors of judgment Li De may have made, there was little question that his long experience with Chinese fighting methods and on Chinese terrain made him one of the best qualified Occidental military authorities on China, and the personal courage of a man who had endured the severe hardships of the Long March commanded admiration and remained a challenge to armchair revolutionaries all over the world. For Li De, an outsized foreigner, the Long March had presented some special hardships. He had stomach complaints and was badly in need of a dentist, but his first problem was to keep supplied with shoes large enough for his enormous number 11s. There did not seem to be any shoes that big in China. For 3 years he had lived without any contact with Europeans, most of the time without books to read. When I was in Bowen, he was delighted to have gotten a hold of a copy of the huge China yearbook, which he carefully digested from cover to cover, including its innumerable tables of statistics, a feat constituting one of the few things he could boast in common with the yearbook editor, H.G.W. Woodhead, CBE. This blue-eyed, fair-haired Aryan had not spoken a word of Chinese when he first immersed himself alone with his Oriental comrades, and he still had to conduct all his serious conversations through interpreters, or in German, Russian, or French. It was almost impossible to believe that under any genius of command the Reds could have emerged victorious against the odds that faced them throughout the year of the Fifth Campaign. It was not the phenomenon of foreign support on the side of the Reds, but its presence in a major degree on the side of the Kuomintang that characterized the last struggle of the Jiangxi Soviet Republic. Quite clearly the Chinese Red Army was not officered by Russian Bolsheviks, mercenaries of Moscow rubles, or puppet troops of Stalin. Chinese and foreign newspapers during the anti-Red Wars used to regularly report how many corpses of Russian officers were found on the battlefield after a Kuomintang attack on the Reds. No foreign corpses were ever produced, yet so effective was this propaganda that many non-communist Chinese really thought of the Red Army as some kind of foreign invasion. So much for Jiangxi. During the next 2 years of the Long March, the Reds were almost entirely cut off from contact even with their own party members in the coastal cities of China, and the Comintern only infrequently got into direct communication with the Red Army. Wang Ming, the Chinese party's chief delegate in Moscow, must have found it very difficult at times to get accurate information even on the location of the main forces of the Red Army for his reports to the Comintern, and some of his articles in Impreca seem to reflect that. I happened to be in Bowen one day when some copies of Impreca arrived, and I saw Lo Fu, the American-educated secretary of the Central Committee of the party, eagerly devouring them. He mentioned casually that he had not seen an Impreca for nearly 3 years, and not until September 1936, while I was still with the Reds, did the detailed account of the proceedings of the 7th Congress of the Communist International, held just a year previously, finally reach the Red capital of China. It was these reports which brought to the Chinese Communists for the first time the fully developed thesis of the International Anti-Fascist United Front tactics which were to guide them in their policy during the months ahead, when revolt was to spread throughout the northwest and to shake the entire Orient. And once more the Comintern and Stalin were to assert their will in the affairs of China, in a manner that would sharply affect the development of the revolution. I was to view that episode from the sidelines again in Beijing. 6. Farewell to Red China. 2 interesting things happened before I left Bowen. On October the 9th, radio messages from Gansu reached us, telling us of the successful junction at Huining of the vanguard of the 4th Red Army with Chen Kang's 1st Division of the 1st Army Corps. All the regular Red Army forces were now concentrated in northwest China, with good lines of communications established. Orders for winter uniforms poured into the factories of Bowen and Wuzhijian. The combined forces of the 3 armies reportedly numbered between 80,000 and 90,000 seasoned, well-equipped warriors. Celebrations and rejoicing were held in Bowen and throughout the Soviet districts. The long period of suspense during the fighting in South Gansu was ended. Everyone now felt a new confidence in the future, with the whole of the best Red troops in China now concentrated in a large new territory, and nearby another 100,000 sympathetic troops of the Dongbei Army, whom they had come to think of as allies. The Reds now believed that their proposals for a united front would be heard with keener interest at Nanjing. The second important event was an interview I had with Mao Zedong just before I left, in which, for the first time, he indicated concrete terms on the basis of which the Communists would welcome peace with the Kuomintang and cooperate to resist Japan. Some of these terms had already been announced in a manifesto issued by the Communist Party in August. In my conversation with Mao, I asked him to explain the reasons for his new policy. First of all, he began, the seriousness of Japanese aggression. It is becoming more intensified every day, and is so formidable a menace that before it all the forces of China must unite. Besides the Communist Party, there are other parties and forces in China, and the strongest of these is the Kuomintang. Without its cooperation, our strength at present is insufficient to resist Japan in war. Nanjing must participate. The Kuomintang and the Communist Party are the 2 main political forces in China, and if they continue to fight now in civil war, the effect will be unfavorable for the anti-Japanese movement. Second, since autumn 1935, the Communist Party has been urging, by a manifesto, a union of all parties in China for the purpose of resisting Japan, and to this program the entire populace has responded with sympathy, notwithstanding the fact that the Kuomintang has continued its attacks upon us. The third point is that many patriotic elements, even in the Kuomintang, now favour a reunion with the Communist Party. Anti-Japanese elements, even in the Nanjing government and Nanjing's own armies, are today ready to unite because of the peril to our national existence. These are the main characteristics of the present situation in China, and because of them we are obliged to reconsider in detail the concrete formula under which such cooperation in the national liberation movement can become possible. The fundamental point of unity which we insist upon is the national liberation anti-Japanese principle. In order to realize it, we believe there must be established a national defense democratic government. Its main tasks must be to resist the foreign invader, to grant popular rights to the masses of the people, and to intensify the development of the country's economy. We will therefore support a parliamentary form of representative government, an anti-Japanese salvation government, a government which protects and supports all popular patriotic groups. If such a republic is established, the Chinese Soviets will become a part of it. We will realize in our areas measures for a democratic parliamentary form of government. Does that mean, I asked, that the laws of such a democratic government would also apply in Soviet districts? Mao replied in the affirmative. He said that such a government should restore and once more realize Sun Yat-sen's final will and his three basic principles during the Great Revolution, which were alliance with the USSR and those countries which treat China as an equal, union with the Chinese Communist Party, and fundamental protection of the interests of the Chinese working class. If such a movement develops in the Comintern, he continued, we are prepared to cooperate with and support it, and to form a united front against imperialism, such as existed in 1925 to 1927. We are convinced that this is the only way left to save our nation. Is there any immediate cause for the new proposals? I inquired. They must certainly be regarded as the most important decision in your party's history in a decade. The immediate causes, Mao explained, are the severe new demands of Japan, capitulation to which must enormously handicap any attempts at resistance in the future, and the popular response to this deepening threat of Japanese invasion in the form of a great people's patriotic movement. These conditions have in turn produced a change in attitude among certain elements in Nanjing. Under the circumstances, it is now possible to hope for the realization of such a policy as we propose. Had it been offered in this form a year ago or earlier, neither the country nor the Kuomintang would have been prepared for it. At present, negotiations are being conducted. While the Communist Party has no great positive hopes of persuading Nanjing to resist Japan, it is nevertheless possible. As long as it is, the Communist Party will be ready to cooperate in all necessary measures. If Chiang Kai-shek prefers to continue the civil war, the Red Army will also receive him. In effect, Mao made a formal declaration of the readiness of the Communist Party, the Soviet government, and the Red Army to cease civil war and further attempts to overthrow Nanjing by force, and to submit to the high command of a representative central government, provided there was created the political framework in which the cooperation of other parties besides the Kuomintang would be possible. At this time also, though not as a part of the formal interview, Mao indicated that the Communists would be prepared to take such changes in normal culture as would facilitate cooperation, without fundamentally affecting the independent role of the Red Army and the Communist Party. Thus, if it were necessary, the Red Army would change its name to National Revolutionary Army. The name Soviets would be abandoned, and the agrarian policy would be modified during the period of preparation for the war against Japan. During the turbulent weeks that lay ahead, Mao's statement was to have an important influence on events. In the middle of October 1936, after I'd been with the Reds nearly 4 months, arrangements were finally completed for my return to the White World. It had not been easy. Jiang Xueliang's friendly Dongbei troops had been withdrawn from nearly every front and replaced by Nanjing or other hostile forces. There was only one outlet then, through a Dongbei division which still had a front with the Reds near Luozhuan, a walled city a day's motor trip north of Xi'an. I walked down the main street of defended peace for the last time, and the further I got toward the gate, the more reluctantly I moved. People popped their heads out of offices to shout last remarks. My poker club turned out en masse to bid the maestro goodbye, and some little devils trudged with me to the walls of Bowen. I stopped to take a picture of old Zhou and old Xie, their arms thrown around each other's shoulders. Only Mao Zedong failed to appear. He was still asleep. "Don't forget my artificial arm," called Tsai. "Don't forget my films," urged Lu Dingyi. "We'll be waiting for the air fleet," laughed Yang Shangkun. "Send me in a wife," demanded Li Kenong. "And send back those 4 ounces of cocoa," chided Bo Gu. The whole Red University was seated out in the open under a great tree listening to a lecture by Luo Fu when I went past. They all came over, and we shook hands, and I mumbled a few words. Then I turned and forded the stream, waved them a farewell, and rode up quickly with my little caravan. I might be the last foreigner to see any of them for a while, I thought. It was very depressing. I felt that I was not going home, but leaving it. In 5 days we reached the southern frontier, and I waited there for 3 days, staying in a tiny village and eating black beans and wild pig. It was a beautiful wooded country, alive with game, and I spent the days in the hills with some farmers and red soldiers hunting pig and deer. The bush was crowded with huge pheasants, and one day we even saw, far out of range, 2 tigers streaking across a clearing in a valley drenched with the purple gold of autumn. The front was absolutely peaceful, and the Reds had only 1 battalion stationed here. On the 20th I got through no man's land safely and behind the Dongbei lines, and on a borrowed horse next day I rode into Luozhuan, where a truck was waiting for me. A day later I was in Xianfu. At the drum tower I jumped down from beside the driver and asked one of the Reds, who was wearing Dongbei uniforms, to toss me my bag. A long search, and then a longer search, while my fears increased. Finally, there was no doubt about it. My bag was not there. In that bag were a dozen diaries and notebooks, 30 rolls of film, the first still and moving pictures ever taken of the Chinese Red Army, and several pounds of red magazines, newspapers, and documents. It had to be found. Excitement under the drum tower, while traffic policemen curiously gazed from a short distance away. Whispered consultations. Finally it was realized what had happened. The truck had been loaded with gunny sacks full of broken Dongbei rifles and guns being sent for repairs, and my bag, in case of any search, had been stuffed into such a sack also. Back in Xianyang, on the opposite shore of the Wei River, 20 miles behind us, the missing object had been thrown off with the other loads. The driver stared ruefully at the truck. "Tamada," he offered in consolation. It was already dusk, and the driver suggested that he wait till morning to go back and hunt for it. Morning? Something warned me that morning would be too late. I insisted, and I finally won the argument. The truck reversed and returned, and I stayed awake all night in a friend's house in Xianfu, wondering whether I would ever see that priceless bag again. If it were opened at Xianyang, not only would all my things be lost forever, but that Dongbei truck and all its occupants would be huaila, finished. There were nationalist gendarmes at Xianyang. The bag was found, but my hunch about the urgency of the search had been absolutely correct, for early next morning all traffic was completely swept from the streets, and all roads leading into the city were lined with gendarmes and troops. Peasants were cleared out of their homes along the road, some of the more unsightly huts were simply demolished, so that there would be nothing offensive to the eye. Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek was paying a sudden call on Xianfu. It would have been impossible then for our truck to return over that road to the Wei River, for it skirted the heavily guarded airfield. This arrival of the Generalissimo made an unforgettable contrast with the scenes still fresh in my mind of Mao Zedong, or Xu Haidong, or Lin Biao, or Peng Dehuai nonchalantly strolling down a street in Red China. And the Generalissimo did not have a price on his head, but the precautions taken to protect him in Xi'an were to prove inadequate. He had too many enemies among the very troops who were guarding him.